Okay, our last new topic, program evaluation. I will try to keep this short, but it might be a little longer than the more recent ones. So, as a review, when we talk about research, and we're usually talking about basic research, in which we make hypotheses based on our observations, we test them, collect data, and then determine whether or not our results support or disconfirm our initial hypotheses, and then we can refine it, and that whole process goes. We've talked about inferential statistics as a tool to generalize our results back to a population based on sample data, right? And when we talk about basic research, it's usually done in a lab or in a controlled setting. And when we talk about, experiments, usually that requires uh, a form of basic research, and that you can't allow for all the day-to-day external factors that come into play and might totally throw off your procedures, your measures, or your results. Applied research is much different. And program evaluation is a form of applied research where you're actually working in the real world, where you're trying to investigate a problem or describe a situation and improve or evaluate what's actually happening. And we didn't talk about this type, but one of the forms of qualitative research is action research, in which you are really trying to do your research in an applied manner, and sometimes it can be in mixed methods as well. We try to get or gain knowledge to support in counseling clients and communities, in education, teachers, parents, administrators, and so on. And so when we think about program evaluation research in counseling and in education, they're very similar, even though the parties are slightly different, or we're going to call them stakeholders, the people who are involved, who might be benefiting from or might be harmed by anything that's going on in a particular program, whether it's counseling based or educational. We still want to use the scientific method. And the most important element is that we do some kind of assessment of the context in which our program is operating. And this means we must take into account the culture and the diversity of our population in order to qualify the results. Right now, when we talk about basic research and we get participants and we get a sample, we typically describe that sample so we can see who we can really generalize this to, right? Well, it's 54, middle-aged, middle class, European American women with college degrees, right? Well, that might limit whether or not we can actually generalize what we find back out to the general world, and whether or not it will apply in every situation. There is in psychology in particular, most of the research historically, I think about 78% has been done on, college age psychology students at research universities, most of them being, well, very predominantly being white, and at least buying into whatever um, theories, ideas, values, and beliefs that they need in order to become psychologists, right? And that is an incredible bias. When we are doing applied research, we need to be careful about the context, or the environment and the people who we are dealing with, in order to draw appropriate conclusions. So we will be talking about context a little bit. So program evaluation, then, if we want to define it, right, is a systematic method for collecting, analyzing, and using data to examine the effectiveness and efficiency of programs and contribute to improvement. Now, the goal isn't always to contribute to improvement of a particular program, but it might be the field in general. We'll talk about 5 different models of program evaluations in a minute. All program evaluations provide some sort of feedback to the programs, and they're trying to focus on external validity and real world impact. In other words, how can the results that we obtain from our program evaluation actually generalize out to the real world. That's what generalizability or external validity is, right? The extent to which my results actually impact or will work in the real world. The key terms that we're talking about are context, as we said, the setting within which a program operates. An evaluation is the systematic collection of evidence to guide decisions. The evaluation model is one of these 5 different strategies that can be used to evaluate programs. Evidence refers to any quantitative, qualitative, or behavioral observational data. Process informative evaluations focuses on processes, and they are typically used for the improvement of the program, and that is their direct aim. The product or summative evaluation focuses on end results and really is all about continuation, renewal, or whether or not goals have actually been attained. It's kind of at the end of a review cycle. You're looking at what actually has been accomplished, whereas a process evaluation is about what is being accomplished and how is it being accomplished. How can we maybe make that better? Stakeholders refer not just to people who might invest their time and money, but anybody who might be positively or negatively affected by a given program. Now, the goals of program evaluation really are all about trying to demonstrate the value or worth of an intervention or program within a context. And it's used to provide the basis for making some sort of judgment, again, about these different avenues about how we can improve, or whether or not we've met benchmarks, whether or not we can continue, and so on. Typically, program evaluations are dispersed among multiple stakeholders. In other words, sometimes there's an accrediting body, sometimes it's management, sometimes it's the participants, sometimes it's a combination, and actually usually it's a combination of all those different elements and more. And as we talk about the different models, we'll get an idea of these different lenses that we can look at. When we think about the criteria of program evaluations, one, you're thinking about adequacy. Do the results provide an accurate description of the program? In other words, not is the program doing well, but did my evaluation adequately describe what was going on and what the impact was? Sometimes direct impacts are not as large as you would like, but you find that there are indirect impacts. Sometimes you find that you're only looking at one lens or one element of a program, and maybe some kind of bottom line profit or bottom line number of people served, and you're missing a whole bunch of different metrics. Or sometimes the metrics and the bottom line information looks good, but everybody involved in the program is miserable, right? So the question is, am I adequately, depending on what the program is and what it's trying to do, am I adequately describing it? Second is utility. Is the information that I'm giving useful? Can it actually affect the judgment or a decision that I'm going to make? Is it something that management would care about or an accrediting body would care about? Or is it something that will actually help me improve, right? So I might find that people are spending a lot of time on using a particular software for reporting, whether it's in education or counseling. But because of certain licenses, this is the only option. And I may spend a bunch of time reporting on what it's doing. But if there's no option, I have no choice. And it's not going to impact any real change. Likewise, I can describe a whole bunch of user satisfaction and so on. But if I already know that that's high and I have 10 different measures of it, and that's not really what I care about, what I care about is maybe the number of people I'm reaching, right? That doesn't really help me figure out how to reach more people. So I have to make sure that I'm, one, adequately describing the program and whether or not it's doing what it's doing, and I need to make sure the information I provide has some kind of utility. The third thing is feasibility. Are the results and recommendations realistic and achievable? In other words, based on the data that I give, I'm going to suggest some things. or the data will suggest some things. And it might point towards a path that just is not doable because of insufficient funds, insufficient manpower or personnel, I should say human power, insufficient time, right? And those are really the three things, right? Money, people, and time that usually are in short supply in some sense. Finally, propriety. Was the evaluation conducted in an ethical and appropriate manner? Did I invade people's basic human rights? Did I violate conduct? Did I create situations in which people had an incentive to be dishonest or cut corners in order to satisfy the reporting guidelines or participate in what I was doing? All these things I need to make sure that I cover and make sure that it's adequate, it's useful, the recommendations are feasible, and I do it ethically. So why conduct a program evaluation? Well, here are 9 reasons that pretty much speak for themselves, right? You want to figure out if your program's working, whether it's any good, whether it's done what they said it was going to do, and so on. And these are all really important things, and they're all pretty much common sense. But a lot of times programs are established and program evaluations are never conducted. And that can be problematic because we just keep going down a road without ever asking, are we meeting the objectives and are we doing things well? Who are we affecting and how can we be better? Right? So it's an important thing to do. Now, there are 5 perspectives that we're going to talk about, and I'm sure there are more, but these are the 5 that we're going to talk about. 1 is an objective or objectives-oriented model. 2 is a management-oriented model. 3, a consumer-oriented model. 4, expertise-oriented model. And 5, a participant-oriented model. Each of these models can be differentiated based on a couple factors. 1, its primary purpose. 2, the criteria for judging evaluations and whether they're good or not. 3, the consensual assumptions of the model and what it's supposed to be covering and what it's supposed to be, what guidelines it's supposed to be following. 4, the anticipated outcomes, in other words, how is this going to change the world? And 5, the methods used. And each one of these varies a little bit in each one of these dimensions. Now, the first is the objectives-oriented model. And in a counseling program evaluation, for example, it's to determine the extent to which program objectives have been achieved. In these cases, right, we can think of a broader context of different things that have set goals and objectives, such as the United Nations and their goals for reducing world poverty, increasing clean drinking water, and so on. In a counseling perspective, it might be number of clients reached, success rate. If we're talking about substance abuse, it might be relapse behavior. If we're talking about education, it might be graduation rates or retention rates or grade point average or something like that. The goal of this type of model then is to make sure that we have met, or the program has met, the objectives that they outlined. And they should be tangible, they should be concrete, and there should be some kind of measure, right? The criteria for judging then is, again, whether or not those benchmarks have been made or met. Some of the assumptions is that the initial goals or the continuing goals have been updated recently. They were reachable, they were feasible, and so on. The anticipated outcomes of the evaluation is to make a judgment about whether or not the processes that are in place are adequate and resources are plentiful enough to actually meet those objectives. And the methods used to conduct this evaluation is oftentimes very quantitative in nature. Not a lot of description of what's going on and so on, but it's really just taking out or getting a handle on those metrics, whatever those goals and metrics are, and collecting and analyzing the data, right? So like in the case of outreach programs and number of people served, right? You can keep track of those numbers. In terms of client success, you can talk about reduction in symptoms or number of relapses, right? Or graduation rates in high school. So there are numbers. It just comes down to how do we identify those constructs? What metrics are we going to use? Gathering and analyzing the data. When we think of another type, some models are very management oriented. And what this has done is not just to determine whether or not goals have been met, but really giving the people who are in charge the information they need about what changes might need to take place. Especially in times of shrinking budgets, and it always seems like, right, whatever you're involved in, the budget's always shrinking somehow. There was one magical time when there was a bunch of money, and it always keeps getting smaller. But in this way, right, I'm looking for making sure that there's a certain level of productivity. How many, if I'm talking about outreach, how many different clients are people seeing? What is the effectiveness rating of different counselors? Or what is the quality of teaching for different teachers in a school? If I'm talking about world health type things, right, where am I getting the most for my money in terms of preventing deaths in the world, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can go about this, but the goal is to make sure that I'm giving management the decisions in order that they can improve the program. Sometimes it's hiring, sometimes it's firing, sometimes it's the reallocation of money, right? In this case, the criteria for judging evaluations is slightly different, right? In this case, it's making sure that there's a lot of utility to these things. And we're not really worried about the feasibility because we're just giving the information to management and they will have to determine whether or not their plans are feasible or not. In this case, too, we're focused not just on outcomes, but we're focused on a lot of processes. We're focused on a lot of differentiation among different players or different sections of a program, right? I might have 5 different main components to a program, and I want to get information in each one of those. And so it's slightly different than objective-oriented models on a bunch of different dimensions, but it's still very similar in that we're trying to evaluate and improve a program. A third is the consumer-oriented model, and this is really just trying to provide a description of the program to consumers. What happens? How does it happen? How often does it happen? And this is important for other counselors or teachers, prospective clients, students, parents, program administrators, and external stakeholders for whatever program we are evaluating. And Scriven's goal-free model is one where you kind of want people who are describing things to go in blind. So they don't have any idea what the goals are supposed to be, what the program's actually trying to do. They just want to say, this is what I'm observing from a totally agnostic perspective, where I just don't know what's going on. And this is what I'm seeing happen. This is how it's happening. This is when, who's involved, and these are the outcomes that I'm seeing, right? So the goals here are very different in terms of the purpose, right? It's just to describe. My criteria for judging whether or not is really more of an adequate description rather than any kind of feasibility, or I would worry about the ethical side of things too. But I probably wouldn't worry so much about the utility either here because I'm just trying to describe. These are, I would say, the least frequently encountered by professionals because it doesn't have a lot to do with any kind of direct decision making. It's something, in my opinion, that is usually done if you have extra time and money and you can afford to do it. So it's not something you will likely run into. The next kind is the expertise-oriented models. And this is whether or not, the main goal of this is to really determine whether or not a program has met the requirements that it's supposed to be meeting. Any kind of program accreditation where you have to write your reports and be involved in the whole continuous review process so you can be certified to keep functioning is an expertise-oriented model. So you have different layers of administrations that oversee the quality and work on quality control, right? And you want to make sure that, right, buildings are up to code, personnel are adequately trained, teachers have the appropriate certification, counselors have the appropriate certifications and licenses, and so on. And there are governing bodies to make sure that somebody's not just, trying to pass themselves off as an expert when they're not. It's just happened. Actually, I was talking to the guy who manages an apartment building that my wife and I used to manage, and the landlady's son will do repairs, and he's a real interesting guy, but he has his own way of doing things, and he is certainly not licensed, and apparently something he did with the boiler caused a carbon monoxide leak, and it was going through the building, and they shut it down. They called 911 and so on, and they said, you can't turn this thing back on, and I think it was October, so it's kind of cold. Can't turn this boiler back on and heat the building until somebody certified comes and fixes it. You can't have this other guy just do his, kind of off the cuff kind of cheap fixes for it. And that's one of those situations where he could probably fix it, but he might not understand everything that he needs to know about it in order to do it right. And it can cause problems down the road. That's why you probably want to go to a certified mechanic rather than just somebody who fixes cars, right? Because they have some kind of qualified training where they have been tested and they have been judged to be knowledgeable enough to do the job. The final one is the participant-oriented models. And the purpose of this is to try to get a descriptive account of what the program is like from the people who participate in it. And so when we think about the people who participate in it, usually we're talking about, like in a counseling program, the people who see the counselors and the counselors themselves, probably largely focused on the actual people who use the counseling services. In education, right, it would be the students describing it, but you'd also be interested in the teachers, you'd also be interested in the parents, and so on. And it's similar in some ways to the consumer-oriented model, but it's different in that I'm really trying to focus on the experience of the people as they report it. Very qualitative in nature, right? When we're thinking about the different ways or factors that we can evaluate things, we're focusing on an adequate description of user experience. We want to get useful information. We're not really worried about feasibility unless we're making recommendations to improve the user experience. But this is a big part of what's often called a needs assessment, when you get feedback from stakeholders and you get an idea of what their experience of the program is after the program's been going for a little while. So those are the 5 types of models, and I will want you to be able to differentiate between them. There are some descriptions in the quiz. I think that based on what we've talked about, you should have a pretty relatively easy time figuring out which is which. But if you don't, let me know, because that means I didn't describe things clearly. Okay, so when we think about program accountability models, we're going to focus on one, and this is mostly for the counselors, so Whitney, you can tune out for this one, but this is something that I'm supposed to talk about. One, and we're talking about program accountability models, we're talking a lot about contextual responsiveness, and so we're focused on the needs of the clients, and this is true for schools too, but for counseling practices, you need to figure out, who am I trying to serve? What is the population of the people that are involved in receiving our services, and what are their particular needs? Now, there's a pattern that is cyclical, that keeps going over and over, and there's a 4-step sequence of events. One is strategic planning. before the program starts. 2, then program implementation. 3, program assessment. And 4, program feedback. And this all makes sense, right? You plan, figure out what you need based on a needs assessment, you implement it, you assess whether or not it's doing anything that you want it to do, and then you get some kind of feedback as part of the assessment, and you use that assessment to inform the decision makers. If we're thinking about what this looks like, there are 2 distinct elements of it's called the accountability bridge, where you have the program evaluation cycle, and then you have the context evaluation cycle, right? So this first step, you have the planning, implementation, monitoring, assessment, and so on. Then you give the feedback and communicate results. And then you communicate this to the stakeholders. And then they tell you what they think. You use that to plan. Do your needs assessment, a new one now, based on the feedback from the stakeholders. What are we doing? What aren't we doing? What do we need to do better, right? And this is really, I'm figuring out how my program assessment results fit in with the context of where this program is being implemented. And then I get my service objectives that I'm going to get from my needs assessment. I do some more planning, modify my program, implement it, right? Assess, communicate, and you have these 2 things really focused on one, the program nuts and bolts itself, and then the other half is on conveying what the program is doing to the people who are involved and making sure that I cover that context element, right? So there are really 2 different cycles, right? One that focuses on the program and one that focuses on the context. And you can supplement or substitute education for counseling here as well if you wanted to. The model would apply equally well. But this is the model that's typically used in counseling programs, not often used in, or not systematically used in educational systems like public schools or colleges and so on. So that leads us to implementing, or how would you do a program evaluation if you wanted to? Well, the first step is like a research project, clarifying what the broader problem that you're trying to address actually is. And then trying to figure out, well, I'm going to do an intervention, only it's not going to be a study, it's going to be a program. There's going to be a lot of people involved, right? But it is very much like a study. And then I'm going to select my objectives and make sure that they're specific and measurable, just like I would in a study. Then I would describe the nature of the intervention or program. I'd design it, I'd develop it, I'd make sure that I have covered all the culturally responsive and ethical guidelines. I'd have to consider all the different interactions between what I'm doing and external factors. And then I kind of connect the dot through what's called logic modeling. And logic modeling is something where you use your needs assessment to start thinking through the problem in a very logical way. And these are some of the questions that you might be asking, right? What is the problem? Who's affected? What assets do I have? What barriers are there? Sometimes people call this a SWOT analysis, where we're really trying to figure out 6 different elements. 1, what is the situation? What's the problem? And what's going on? Well, why do we care? 2, I'm thinking about the inputs. In other words, what am I going to bring to the table in terms of time and money and personnel and so on? What am I going to do? The next one are the outputs. So I'm going to invest time in developing these ideas and these strategies, and then I'm going to get some people involved, and we're going to do some things, right? We might have sessions. We might have community outreach programs. I might involve parents or teachers, or I might involve the military, right? I might involve different people. So those are my outputs, activities and people, really. And we'll get to this in a minute. Then I have my outcomes. What do I expect to achieve, both in the short term and the long term, and the ultimate impact that my program is going to have. Then I have to consider assumptions that I have about what is actually going to happen with my inputs and my outputs and what kinds of things will be going on, and consider external factors as well, things that are actually going to be impacting the effectiveness of my program, that might make it look like my program works when it doesn't, or might make it look like my program doesn't work when it does, or might interact in some way, right? And that you can think of the external factors just like you would in an experiment where you're trying to get information on the different confounds and all those different threats to internal validity. When we think of it, this is kind of what the template looks like then, right? I have my situation and priorities. I have my inputs. What am I going to put into this? I have, again, staff, volunteers, time, and so on. Tons of stuff that goes in. There's the things that we're going to do and the people who are going to be involved. And then I have short, medium, and long-term outcomes that I'm looking at, right? What are the things that are going to happen immediately? They don't really get me to my end goal, but they're the first step. And then what are things going to look like in a few weeks or a couple months? And then ultimately, after this has been going a while and it gains traction, what do I hope to achieve? All the while I'm thinking about what are the assumptions I'm making about money being available, participation rates, honesty, ethical behavior, right? And then what am I thinking about external factors in terms of my outcomes and my impact, right? What are the things that I need to consider that are going to impact, either bolster my outcomes or inhibit my outcomes? So here's an example of one. It's kind of small. I hope you can read it. I'll try to make sure the resolution is good, but you can look at it in the notes if you can't see it in this video. This is an example. I didn't want it to be too similar to things you're doing because I'm going to want you to do one of these with your research study. This is reducing environmental impact of livestock production or water quality, right? And so the idea here is that all the livestock that we use for food has this negative impact on water quality in our country and causes a bunch of pollution, right? So that's the problem. How can we fix this or make this better? When we think of inputs, right? Well, there's time that's going to go into it. There's grants that can be written about water purification or livestock reduction. I can think of state dollars that might be funded, taxpayer dollars, right? I could get some kind of student assistance with research activities if I'm operating in a university. And then I have some other things I can get too. When I think about these are the things that I'm going to put into it, the kinds of things that I'm going to get out of it then are the different activities and different people participating in those activities. So some activities, right, conduct applied research, educate those who make those decisions about how to ration things. I have participants, lab groups for my applied research, and I have my consulting nutritionists and extension colleagues when I'm talking about educating people who make those decisions on how to ration out resources. Other activities, right? I could engage livestock producers and grazers to improve how they handle animal waste, right? And so I could have some kind of outreach educational program to talk about how they can be more efficient, what the bottom line benefits are going to be for them, and so on. And then these people who are participating again are my livestock producers, grazers, design engineers about trying to get things more efficient. And then again, I have some more options down here that you can read through. So again, I have activities and people who are involved, things I'm going to do and who's going to be impacted or involved in that. Now, in this case, my assumptions, and I can kind of jump to that now, is that one, research findings that we get from our applied research up here are going to be applicable for different regions and at different times of the year, right? I also am assuming that there are going to be other influencing factors for improved outcomes that are going to contribute to my program effects. And that kind of dovetails into my external factors. But we'll get to that in a second. So when I'm thinking about my short term, my midterm, and my ultimate impact, here they have it labeled as learning, behavior, and condition change, final outcomes. So learning, people are going to understand more basically about how this problem works and what solutions are going to be the best. This is going to lead to changes in behavior, how people spend their money, how they handle animal waste, how water purification systems work, maybe different policies, maybe different laws and regulations, we're not sure, right? And then there are condition change, ultimately better water quality. And that's what I'm really trying to get at, right? That's, again, the problem. So my ultimate impact, again, is the problem I've identified in the beginning. Water pollution is bad. I want to improve water. I have to recognize all along here, though, that there are some external factors. And in this case, right, if during this program laws do change and I find that water quality is better because regulations were tightened, it may or may not have anything to do with my program. And I'd have to be able to kind of figure that out. Okay, so this is the basic idea of how you apply a logic model. And you do all this planning prior to developing your program, right? This is where you say, what do I have to invest? How am I going to use it? Who's going to be involved? And what do I hope to achieve? What are the things I'm assuming are going to happen? And what are the other things that might influence things? What are again, those internal validity threats that we are thinking about? Things to remember if you are doing a logic model at some point in your life. Make sure you get all the appropriate stakeholders involved. Don't leave people out because they usually have they're an important voice, either from the investing or the outcome side. Second, start with the end in mind. Always think about, again, what is the problem and what do I hope to ultimately achieve, and work backwards. Third, visualize how each component supports the next. So again, when we're thinking back to these different stages, right, how are my activities going to engage the right people to improve my short, mid, and long-term goals? Finally, in your model, try to keep it simple, brief, and creative. Don't just say what people have already heard. Contribute something new to solving a particular problem. When you check the final model, right, it typically requires a continuous refinement process. Thinking about what's the scale or the scope, what resources do I have, will new resources come up, or will I lose existing resources, right? Do I think that the model will actually be able to do what I wanted to do, or am I working on too small of a scale? And then I have to revise my ultimate outcome, which might not be, if I don't have much money or many resources, just proof of concept that this can work on a small scale, and that might get me some grant money to try to implement it at a larger scale. When we think about specificity, I need to be specific in terms of my outcomes and my measures and how I'm going to actually keep track of things, rather than getting a lot of false positives, right? I want to make sure I'm not making a bunch of type 1 errors in whether or not my program is effective. I want to make sure it's feasible or realistic, and it's plausible, and that can you actually pull it off? So based on this lecture, you have a couple assignments. One, complete the program evaluation quiz, which is only, I think, 8 questions, 8 or 9, and it's pretty short. The second part is that I want you to fill in the logic model template, assuming that your study leads to the development of a program. So if you're doing the animal assisted therapy, say that you're going to you get a new program where you get a bunch of animal therapy dogs, or therapy animals, and you get to use them, and you have a little center that you start, right? Or if you're talking about figuring out how different traits of personality and so on influence relapse behavior, you get to run a center that addresses that. Same with cannabis use in inner city youth. Same with education in general or special education students. Same with military and the idea of resiliency training and so on. So you've developed a program, right? Or somebody's going to fund you based on your research and say, I want you to run this program. I'd like you to describe the situation and need. I'd like you to describe 4 different inputs, so 4 things that you're going to invest. And I don't want huge descriptions here, just bullet point phrases. I want 2 what will you do or activity-based inputs, and 2 who's going to be involved or who do you reach inputs. I want 1 short-term outcome, 1 medium-term outcome, and 1 final impact. I'd like you to describe 2 assumptions necessary for effectiveness, 2 things that you are assuming are going to be the case, that may not, but that you need to have happen, that you're banking on. And then finally, 2 external factors that might be internal validity threats to the effectiveness of your program. Whether it is time of the year, a pandemic happening, an economy crash, something like that, right? That'll mess up anybody's program evaluation. So that is online. Let me see if I can pull it up quick. You can see that there's a spot for the problem, place for your inputs, your outputs, your outcomes or impacts, assumptions, and external factors. So fill that in. There's a Dropbox for it. I already made sure to check that it's open. So Hannah usually sends me an email telling me that I didn't put up a Dropbox or an assignment box. So thank you, Hannah. But I finally did it beforehand. So thanks. Hope you are all doing well. And if you have any questions, please shoot me an email. All right, good luck.